In a world where shadows hide unspeakable horrors and ancient terror awakens, it came from the depths of the cosmos, hungry for fear and ready to feast on humanity. One hero stands between us and oblivion. Will courage prevail, or will fear consume us all? Prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown. The feast begins now. It started with whispers. Faint, desperate murmurs carried through the cold Oregon air. Greystone was a quiet town, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew each other's names. But then, the fear came. The first reports were dismissed. A man found standing in the middle of Main Street at dawn, staring at nothing. Lips moving but making no sound. A family locked inside their home, refusing to answer the door, their faces pale and hollow when the police forced their way in. Then, the panic spread. The news crackled through the airwaves. And if you're just tuning in, we have breaking news out of Greystone, Oregon, where authorities are struggling to explain a series of, well, some are calling them mass hysteria events. Reports say entire families have been found cowering in corners, whispering about something lurking in the dark. Others have barricaded themselves in their homes, refusing to speak, their eyes just empty. Whatever's happening, it's spreading. And folks, it's getting worse. The police station was nearly deserted. The phones rang endlessly, the voices on the other end frantic, begging for help. But there was nothing they could do. Deputy Marks sat in the dim light of his office, watching the footage again. His hands trembled as he rewound the tape, forcing himself to look, forcing himself to understand. A man staggered into view, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His eyes darted wildly, searching the empty street. Then he turned to the camera. It knows. It knows when you're afraid. Don't think about it. Don't let it see it. The screen flickered. A shadow passed behind the man, something that shouldn't be there. A shape that moved without making a sound. The man's face twisted in terror. Then, the screen cut to black. Marks exhaled shakily, rubbing his forehead. He didn't know what he had just seen. A slow creak echoed from the hallway behind him. Maria Carter had been following the reports for weeks. Late nights at her desk, her fingers scrolling through articles, digging through medical research. The symptoms were too specific, too coordinated to be a coincidence. Mass hysteria. That was the official story. But she knew better. She paused the footage on her screen, her eyes narrowing at the image of the shadow. She had seen patterns like this before, old case studies of neurological parasites, organisms that could manipulate the brain, turn fear into control. But those were just theories, weren't they? Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Dr. Carter, you need to get to Greystone. Now. She sat up straight. Who is this? Silence. Then, a voice. A whisper, barely audible. They can smell fear. The line went dead. Maria didn't sleep that night. She sat at her desk, replaying the call in her mind, staring at the frozen image on her screen. The shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a camera glitch. Her instincts screamed at her. This was real. By dawn, she had packed a bag, thrown her laptop into the passenger seat, and started the drive to Greystone. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless. Fog rolled low over the asphalt, swallowing the town's outskirts in a thick, suffocating gray. The closer she got, the heavier the silence became. Something was wrong here. She pulled up to the sheriff's station, but the parking lot was deserted. No squad cars, no officers. The front door stood half open, creaking in the wind. Maria stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with something she couldn't name. Papers were scattered across the floor. Phones rang somewhere in the distance, their shrill tones echoing through the empty halls. And then as she saw him, a man sat slumped in a chair behind the front desk, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. He didn't blink, didn't move. His chest rose and fell in shallow, mechanical breaths. Sir. Maria stepped forward. Are you all right? The man's head snapped up so fast she froze. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing nearly all of his irises. His lips quivered as he tried to form words. Don't be afraid, he whispered. Maria's pulse spiked. Who did this to you? His hands clenched into fists. His entire body trembled, like he was fighting something unseen. Then, his voice changed, flattening. becoming something cold, something wrong. It's already here. The radio on the desk crackled. A burst of static. Then, a voice shaking, barely audible beneath the distortion. "Dr. Carter, run." The lights flickered. A deep, unnatural sound vibrated through the walls, like something vast exhaling in the dark. And Maria knew. She wasn't alone. Maria didn't think. She ran. The sound, the low, guttural exhalation, seemed to pulse through the walls, vibrating in her bones. The deputy behind the desk let out a choked gasp, his body seizing. His fingers clawing at his own skin as if trying to rip something out of himself. She reached for him, but the radio crackled again. "Get out of there." Maria turned and bolted down the hall. Her footsteps echoed in the emptiness of the station. The lights above her flickered violently. Shadows stretched unnaturally against the walls, twisting and shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The front door was just ahead. A few more steps. Something moved behind her. A whisper. A breath. Maria dove forward just as the hallway behind her imploded into darkness. A void. Absolute and hungry, swallowing the space where she had just stood. She crashed through the front doors and hit the pavement hard. Her palms scraped against the asphalt, but she barely noticed. She spun around. The doorway of the sheriff's station was still there. The building stood exactly as it had before. But inside, there was only blackness. Not shadows. Not an absence of light. Just nothing. And then, from that nothingness, something stepped forward. At first, it was only an outline. A vague, humanoid shape made of shifting void. It had no face, no eyes. But somehow, Maria knew it was looking directly at her. Her breath hitched. A feeling gripped her chest, a primal, instinctive fear. The thing shuddered, as if breathing her in. And then it moved. Not walking. Not running. It flickered forward, like a skipping frame in a corrupted video, closing the distance between them in an instant. Maria stumbled back. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She knew, if she let the fear take over, it would consume her. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing her breath to slow. One thought repeated in her mind. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. The sound of static. The weight of something standing inches from her face. Maria opened her eyes. The thing was gone, but she wasn't safe. She turned, sprinting for her car, fumbling for the keys. The moment she threw herself inside and slammed the door, her phone buzzed. A new message. No number. No sender. Just 2 words. It's spreading. Maria's hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. Her breath came in short gasps, her mind racing. The thing, whatever it was, wasn't just some entity lurking in the shadows. It was intelligent. It was hunting. And it was spreading. She forced herself to focus. She needed answers. The streets of Greystone were eerily empty. Cars sat abandoned, doors left wide open. Houses stood dark, curtains drawn. It felt like a town already lost, like something had hollowed it out from the inside. She knew where she had to go. Dr. Elias Harlow, a retired neuroscientist, once ridiculed for his research on neural parasites. He had disappeared from the scientific community years ago, claiming he was onto something the world wasn't ready to hear. Maria had dismissed him as a conspiracy theorist. Now, he was the only person who might understand what was happening. She drove through the town's outskirts, following the winding road up into the dense pine forest. The signal on her phone had vanished miles ago, leaving her alone with only the sound of her tires crunching over gravel. Harlow's cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, barely visible through the mist. The windows were dark. No sign of movement. Maria stepped out of the car. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against her skin like an invisible weight. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. She knocked once. Silence. She knocked again, harder. A shuffling sound from inside. Then, the door creaked open just enough for her to see a single bloodshot eye staring out at her. Dr. Harlow's voice was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." Maria pushed the door open, stepping inside before he could stop her. The cabin was a disaster. Books, papers, and old research notes scattered everywhere. Strange diagrams covered the walls. At the center of it all, an old television screen crackled with static. "I don't have time for warnings," Maria said, holding up her phone. It's happening. People are disappearing. Or worse. Harlow exhaled sharply, running a hand through his unkempt hair. It found you, didn't it? He muttered. Maria hesitated. You know what it is? Harlow nodded slowly. It doesn't have a name, he said. But I call it the Hollow. A parasite that doesn't just feed on fear, it becomes it. The more people are afraid, the stronger it gets. The more it spreads. Maria's stomach turned. So how do we stop it? Harlow let out a hollow laugh. You don't, he said. You survive. The lights in the cabin flickered. Then, from the woods outside, something exhaled. A deep, endless, inhuman breath. And the shadows at the edge of the trees began to move. The sound outside grew heavier, thick and guttural, like something vast shifting just beyond sight. The shadows at the tree line pulsed, writhing like living things. Maria turned to Harlow. You've seen this before, haven't you? His expression was grim. I survived it before. Barely. Maria's pulse pounded. How? Harlow hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of a desk littered with old research papers. His gaze flickered to the window, where the darkness outside began to stretch toward them. It doesn't just feed on fear, he murmured. It spreads through it. Every scream, every panic attack, every racing heartbeat. It's like fuel. It multiplies in terror. Maria felt cold seep into her bones. So what do we do? Just pretend we're not afraid. Harlow didn't smile. You don't pretend. You kill it at the source. The wind outside howled. The walls of the cabin creaked under some unseen pressure. Maria took a step forward. What source? Harlow exhaled. It wasn't always like this. It started as something smaller. A single host. One infected mind. The Hollow doesn't come from nowhere. It needs a beginning. A body to anchor itself to this world. Maria's mind reeled. You mean there's an original host? Harlow nodded. If we find it, we end this. Cut the head off the beast. A slow, rhythmic knocking echoed from the cabin door. 3 deliberate taps. Maria's breath hitched. Harlow didn't move. His entire body tensed, his knuckles going white as he gripped the edge of the desk. He shook his head, almost imperceptibly. The knocking came again. 3 slow, heavy beats against the wood. Then a voice, soft, familiar. Dr. Carter. Maria froze. She knew that voice. She had heard it only hours ago, over the phone, warning her to run. The cabin lights flickered violently. The television screen behind Harlow crackled with static, and for the briefest moment, an image appeared. A face, stretched and distorted, eyes hollow. Mouth moving soundlessly. Maria took a shaky step backward. The knocking stopped. Then the door burst open. A wave of darkness poured inside, and the Hollow stepped through. Maria barely had time to react before the darkness rushed in. It wasn't like smoke or fog. It was something alive, twisting, shifting, reaching. She dove back, knocking over a stack of books as she scrambled away. Harlow grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back of the cabin. Don't let it touch you, he hissed. The Hollow stood in the doorway, a shape carved from nothing. Its form flickered like an image struggling to stay in focus. And then it spoke. Or rather, it echoed. Voices. So many voices, overlapping, twisting together into something almost human. Dr. Carter, you came too late. Maria's stomach twisted. It was her own voice. The Hollow took a slow step forward. The wood beneath it rotted instantly, eaten away by the void bleeding from its body. Harlow grabbed a metal box from a shelf, his hands moving fast. It doesn't like light, he muttered. And it doesn't like stability. Fear is chaos. So we take that away. He flipped a switch. A blinding burst of light exploded from a device in his hands, flooding the cabin in a cold, sterile glow. The Hollow shrieked, a noise so sharp and unnatural Maria's vision blurred. Its form twisted violently, retreating from the light, the black tendrils of its body snapping back like scorched nerves. But it wasn't leaving. It was angry. The shadows along the walls began to pulse, tendrils slithering around the edges of the room. Maria turned to Harlow. What now? He shoved a stack of old maps and notes into her hands. We need to find the original host. If we can kill it, we sever its connection to this world. Maria flipped through the pages. Handwritten scrawls. Coordinates. Newspaper clippings. A single date stood out. 1954, Greystone Asylum. Before she could speak, the cabin windows exploded inward. The hollow rushed forward, its body shifting, splitting apart, becoming many. Hands grabbed at Maria's arms, at her throat, at her mind. She felt its touch like cold fingers digging into her thoughts, whispering in 1,000 voices at once. "You are afraid. You are afraid. You are afraid." She screamed, but then Harlow yanked her backward, throwing them both out the cabin door. They hit the dirt hard. The moment Maria opened her eyes, the cabin was gone. No fire, no wreckage, just an empty patch of earth, like it had never existed. Harlow groaned beside her. "It's not playing anymore," he muttered. "It's hunting." Maria looked down at the old asylum records still clutched in her hands. "If we're gonna end this," she said, heart pounding, "we need to go to where it began." Harlow exhaled, then nodded, and together, they ran. The asylum loomed ahead, swallowed by the forest. Greystone Asylum had been abandoned for decades. Its windows shattered, its walls overtaken by creeping vines. Maria parked the car at the rusted gates, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. The asylum's presence was suffocating, like the earth itself had tried to forget it existed. Harlow exhaled beside her. This place was shut down in 1954. Unexplained incidents, mass panic among the patients. They blamed an infectious hysteria, but I think we both know it was something else. Maria glanced down at the asylum records in her lap. A name was circled in red ink. Patient 0. Daniel Whitaker. Whitaker was the first recorded case, Maria said. The first one who saw it. Harlow nodded grimly. And if we're lucky, we'll find out why he never left. The wind howled through the trees as they stepped inside. The asylum smelled of decay and time itself, the air thick with dust and something older, fouler. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, illuminating the long-abandoned corridors. Their footsteps echoed. And then, a whisper. Maria froze. It came from ahead, deep in the darkened hallways. A voice, calling her name. She turned to Harlow. Her voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear?" But Harlow's face had gone pale. "It's waiting for us." They pressed forward, past rusted gurneys and faded warnings scrawled across the walls. The asylum groaned around them, as if the very structure was alive. At last, they reached the lower levels. The air here was different, heavier. Maria could feel something waiting beyond the last door at the end of the corridor. She pushed it open. The room beyond was circular, the walls covered in frantic writings, scratched into the surface over and over again. Words repeated endlessly, written in different hands, in different years. "Don't let it in. IT feeds. Fear is the gateway." And in the center of the room, a chair. Old, rusted, shackles still hanging from the arms. And someone was sitting in it. Maria's breath caught. Daniel Whitaker. Or what was left of him. A withered husk of a man, his body impossibly thin, his skin stretched tight over brittle bones. His head lifted slowly, empty eyes locking onto hers. And then, with a voice dry as dust, he smiled. "You came," he rasped. "You finally came." Maria took a slow step forward. "Whitaker." His grin widened. The shadows in the room shifted. "I was Whitaker," the thing in the chair murmured. "Once. But I was afraid. And now, I am so much more." The walls shuddered. The darkness deepened. And Maria realized Whitaker wasn't a host. He was the origin. The hollow had been born inside him, growing, waiting, spreading. Harlow swore under his breath. "We have to end this. Now." Maria's hands clenched into fists. "How?" Whitaker laughed, a hollow, terrible sound. "You can't. You don't fight fear. You become it." The lights died. The room imploded into darkness. Maria felt it instantly, something slithering into her mind, pressing into her memories, her past, her fears. Her mother's funeral. The night she almost drowned. The feeling of being utterly alone. The hollow fed on it all. Maria screamed, but no sound came. And then, a hand grabbed hers. Harlow. His grip was steady, warm, real. "Maria," his voice was firm, cutting through the blackness. "It's not real. None of it. Don't let it win." Maria's breathing steadied. And then she understood. The hollow wasn't unstoppable. It wasn't some god. It was just a parasite. It needed fear to survive. And if they denied it that fear, if they rejected it completely, it would starve. Maria opened her eyes. The darkness still surrounded her, whispering, screaming, showing her every nightmare she had ever feared. And she let go of the fear, of the doubt, of everything the hollow wanted her to feel. And just like that, the darkness shuddered. Whitaker's form convulsed, his twisted body thrashing. His mouth opened in a soundless wail as his skin began to crack and splinter like dried earth. The hollow was breaking apart. Maria stood firm. "You don't own me." And with those words, the darkness collapsed in on itself. Whitaker let out one last, shuddering breath. And then his body disintegrated into dust. The room snapped back into reality. The asylum stood still, silent. It was over. Maria turned to Harlow, exhaling. "We survived." He let out a breathless laugh. Barely. They walked out together, leaving the asylum behind. And as the sun rose over Greystone, Maria knew the hollow was gone. For now.